Welcome to this exchange talk hosted by the RCS Research and Knowledge Exchange Department. We are delighted to welcome one of our freshly minted doctors, Dr. Andrew Bova, to talk to us about competitive bagpiping this afternoon. Dr. Andrew Bova began playing the bagpipes at the age of 12. And as you will hear from his dulcet tones this evening, he grew up just outside Pittsburgh in the United States. So I cry imposter, I say. He holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts and a Master of Music degree, both in piping, so maybe not that much of an imposter, from Carnegie Mellon University, and has recently completed his PhD at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland and St Andrews, no relation, University. He was an active member of the research community while he was studying with us. As a performer, he's been a consistently successful solo competitor in the professional grades, competing in the USA, Canada, and Scotland. In addition to his solo career, Andrew is an avid bandsman with a varied history in pipe bands, having served as the pipe sergeant of Carnegie Mellon University Pipes and Drums, as a member of the famous 78th Fraser Highlanders Bagpipe Band from Toronto, as well as the Windsor Police Pipe Band and the Peel Regional Police Pipe Band. Under the direction of Pipe Major Ryan Canning, Andrew was a member of the 2015 World Pipe Band Championship winning Shots Pipe Band, and he currently plays with Field Marshal Montgomery. In addition to his playing and research, Andrew teaches within the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland's undergraduate degree courses in traditional music and piping, and has delivered guest lectures for the University of Edinburgh. He regularly features as a recitalist and instructor in piping workshops throughout Europe, and is a contributor to Piping Today magazine, and works part-time at the National Piping Centre, just over the road from our physical campus in Glasgow. A couple of housekeeping announcements before we crack on with the meat of the talk. Tonight's BSL interpreter is Yvonne Strain, and their video is going to be available and visible throughout the talk, and during the presentations, they'll be shown on the right-hand side of the screen. You can scale that screen up by hovering over the video and using the arrow. We're sorry that there is no closed captioning for this evening's event. However, the talk is being recorded, and if that's something that you require, if you email in, then we'll be able to sort that for you. Andrew will talk for 45 minutes, no more and no less, you have been warned. And then afterwards, there will be a question and answer session that will last approximately 15 minutes. If you would like to ask a question, then please write it in the Q&A function, which you'll be able to find if you scroll to the bottom of the screen. If you absolutely love somebody's question, you can upvote that, and that will make it higher on my list of things that I will do, that I'll be able to see and then be able to call upon that if the sort of group would like it. For the duration of this webinar, you will have your cameras and microphones off, so it'll just be Andrew and Yvonne that you'll see. If you'd like to tweet about tonight's event, and I encourage you to do this, please do so at RCS_the exchange. There's a full list of upcoming exchange talks that can be found in the link in the chat. Without further ado, I would like to pass over to a great friend and colleague for what is going to be a really interesting and inspiring talk, Dr. Andrew Bova.
Thank you very much, James. That's the most stressful part of my evening over, worrying about what you were going to say or not say about me and that. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. So thank you all for coming. I got quite a few nice messages from people, many of whom I haven't spoken to or seen in quite a long time, saying they were going to come tonight to hear me speak. So I very much appreciate that. And I look forward to your questions at the end of the talk. I'm going to talk to you tonight a little bit about my research, which I recently completed. My research really involves the development of piping from 1947 to 2015 and how things changed, stayed the same, innovated during that time. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to talk about everything in my research, so what I'm going to focus on tonight is a little bit about repertoire selection and the decision-making processes of competing pipers. Why do we as competing pipers decide to play what we play in competition or decide not to play certain things in competition? What are the factors that influence these choices? I think with any sort of autoethnographic research, which mine inherently is, it's important to start with that and tell you a little bit about my experience in piping and how I came to this research topic, because ultimately everything that I speak about this evening, there's been quite a lot of analysis of the data and analysis of the repertoire, but it comes through me as a filter. And it's important to understand where I've come from. So my musical career didn't begin with piping. It began with classical music. I was a classical flautist before I started playing pipes, and I actually worked as a professional classical musician before I moved to Scotland. I didn't come to piping through family or heritage ties, anything like that. I came to piping through happenstance. I just happened to be exposed to it, and I really enjoyed it, and I took it up, and now it's what I do for a living. To that end, the fact that there is no sort of familial tie or heritage tie to it, I still feel a strong sense of responsibility to the piping community and to the tradition. I would consider myself to be a tradition bearer. Certain things have been passed on to me, and now it's my responsibility to take these things and pass them on to a new generation of players. There's, of course, in that room for developing the tradition, changing the tradition, but I feel that onus to the tradition. That being said, I do consider myself a musician first and a piper second. And to some extent, that caused some clashes early on in my piping career. And that I was being presented with these ideas of tradition and norms and musical ideas, but at times they were presented as sacrosanct. And because of my experience as a broader musician, I always wanted to question these things, not just what do we do, but why do we do it? And that at times was met with some pushback. And it got to a point where I became very frustrated with the sort of status quo of piping, to the point where I nearly walked away from piping as a career and moved into classical music as my career. Now, I was very fortunate. I had wonderful university professors who sort of guided me and helped me to realize that these two things didn't necessarily have to clash, but they could inform one another in a way that was productive and, helped to create new ideas. So a key impetus for my research has been my lived experience in piping, especially involving repertoire that we play. So in pipe bands especially, I noticed that there seemed to be this trend of repetition. Now, for the pipers in the audience, in terms of this, it's something we all know, but hasn't really been documented. So I started thinking about my experience in grade one. Now, at the time of publishing my dissertation, I played in grade one for 10 years. Grade one, for those of you who don't know, is the top level of pipe band competition. And I started to notice in my own playing that, there was a sort of repetition of repertoire happening. And I was becoming increasingly displeased with my experience in MSR, the MSR side. MSR, March just being real. The MSR side of my playing. I found I was discontent to be learning and performing repertoire that I'd heard ad nauseum over the course of my grade one band career. I found that MSR contests, as a result of that, they seemed to have little individual musicality between bands. Bands were playing very similar tunes. And the result therein was that I found, or at least it was my perception, that the competitions almost weren't music competitions anymore. They were becoming tone and technique competitions. And that's not really why we play music, is it? And out of that came the idea that I wasn't maybe so much a musician when I was playing these MSRs, but I was more of an athlete. I was going to band practice trying to repeat the same motions in an exact way. And it wasn't exactly musically enriching for me. This led me to wonder, why is it that we play such a limited repertoire in pipe bands in the MSR contests? And really, how limited is the repertoire? Is the repertoire as limited as we think it is? And this all kind of came to a head when I really became bored playing in grade one with the MSRs. I vividly remember showing up to a practice in shots, in the off season before the upcoming competitive season, and we were given the tune Pretty Marion. Pretty Marion's a fantastic reel. It's one of my favorite reels. And I played it before. And I remember I played it through the first time on the practice chanter, and I actually tossed my chanter on the table. And I thought to myself, I can't picture myself playing this for another 2 to 4 years every other day. And that was really concerning for me. I really liked that tune. Going back and visiting an old tune should be like seeing an old friend, thinking about where were you when you played that tune? How have you developed since you last played that tune? So that sort of concern started to weigh on me. So I decided to undertake an analysis of exactly what my repertoire in grade 1 had been, to see if it really was repetitive. So what you see on the screen here is my grade 1 career from 2007 to 2018 and all the repertoire that I played during that time. It's important to note, in grade 1, bands play 2 MSRs every year. So looking at this, at a glance, I started to think, well, there is some repetition in there. One of the things that I noticed was sort of repertoire by consecutive years. So there was a lot of repetition from year to year in what I was playing. And here you can see all the tunes and all the consecutive years that I played them. So there's obviously, I started to see this repetition, and I thought, I've got to find a way to show this statistically, because as I go and look at the broader repertoire of all pipe bands, it's going to be a massive amount of data to sift through. And so what I came up with was an idea called total possible repertoire. And it's a method that shows the percentage of performances with non-repeated repertoire in competition. And basically you do that by taking the number of unique tunes that were played divided by the total number of performances. So for example, if you have 10 competitors, say in a solo jig competition, and 6 of those competitors play the same tune, and all the others play different tunes, and you have 5 total unique tunes, 5 tunes out of a possible 10, 50% total possible repertoire. So basically, the lower the TPR number, the more repetition of music there is. The higher the TPR number, the less repetition of music there is. I have to say, I am not arguing that I think there should be 100% TPR percentages in anything. I think that some repetition is good. A little bit of familiarity is always a nice thing. I also don't know that there are actually enough tunes out there to fill all those slots. But again, it's just a tool to kind of demonstrate in terms of percentages how often things are being repeated. So here's all the tunes that I've played in grade 1, well, at least from 2007 to 2018. In the March, there are 8 tunes. Now, theoretically, I could have played 20, which gives us a total possible repertoire of 40%. In other words, 60% of the time I'm playing a tune that I've already played before. In the Strathspey, there are 8 unique tunes again, 40%. And in the reel, there are 6 for 30%. So 70% of the time I was playing reels in grade 1 MSRs, I was playing something that I'd played before. I think it's worthy of noting that Blair Drummond, I played for 6 out of 10 seasons. And John Morrison, I played for 9 out of 10 seasons. So this confirms what I really thought about what was going on in my own repertoire and my own pipe band experience. And so I wanted to expand that and look at the bigger picture of what was going on in the repertoire situation, not only in pipe bands, but in solo piping as well. So I set out some research parameters. I decided only to look at light music. And for those in the audience who maybe aren't pipers, bagpipe music falls into 2 broad categories, light music and pibroch. Pibroch is, it gets called the classical music of bagpipes. I don't really like that. It's art music for bagpipes. But I decided not to look at that because there's loads of sort of cultural baggage that come with pibroch that I didn't really want to get involved with. I decided just to look at light music. Pibroch can wait for another day. And then within light music, I decided to focus on bands and solos. So for bands, I looked at the very top grade, grade 1. I didn't look at any of the other competitive grades. And I only looked at the World Pipe Band Championships because that's the best representation of what's being played in pipe or in grade 1 piping in any given year. I also, in solo competitions, so I looked at MSRs and I looked at hornpipe jig competitions. I looked at the Northern Meeting, the Argyllshire Gathering, the Glenfiddich. Those were the big three, but I also looked at the Uistambara. Now, pipers in the audience might wonder a little bit about why I included the Uistambara. The reason was it was harder to find information on what was being played than I expected, and there was a lot of good data available in terms of the repertoire being performed at the Uistambara. So it is a high-level competition. It was a qualifier for the Glenfiddich, so I decided to include it. And the time period that I looked at, I would love to look back as far as I could, but you have to have some sort of time parameter. So I started in 1947. That's when the World Pipe Band Championships were sort of begun in their modern iteration. They did exist before that as the Cowell Games, but it was 1947 that the Worlds became the World's Championship. And 2015 was a good end date because it was around when I was originally meant to submit my PhD dissertation. And you've got to have a cutoff somewhere. So I went with 2015. Today, unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about everything, so we're going to focus on the solo and the band MSR competitions, and we're really going to focus sort of on the later years in this time frame. So as I was researching, one thing that kind of came to the fore was this idea of what I call the competition performance paradigm. So before the folk revival in the 1970s, bagpipe performance was widely limited to competition. If you wanted to play things like MSRs or hornpipe jigs, you needed to compete to do it. Of course, you can go out and play parades, or you can go out and do weddings and funerals, but at those, you're not really going to get to play the more difficult tunes. Now, a part of this, though, was that to gain clout in the piping community, you had to be a successful competitor. That's less so the case now. You think about people like Finlay MacDonald, Ross Ainsley, Stephen Blake, pipers who are very, very well regarded, who don't compete because they've gone down the sort of what we would call the folky route of piping rather than competitive route of piping. But for a long time, the only way to kind of gain success or accolade was through competitive success. And a good example of that, Doogie Pincock talks about it in the book A Piper's Tale. He references Duncan Johnston. Now, Duncan Johnston was a massively talented performer, a brilliant composer, a wonderful teacher. His studio has gone on to be incredibly successful, but he doesn't necessarily figure that highly in a lot of people's idea of significant pipers because he didn't compete. And because he didn't have that competitive success, he's often left off lists. However, this influence of competition on a piper's social standing created an environment wherein judges have become or became the most influential consumers of pipe music. And to that end, it creates a formula for success. In order to be regarded as a successful player, you have to win competitions. In order to win competitions, you have to appease the judges. And so, at times, judges' preferences have informed musical decisions. Terry Tully, the pipe major of St. Lawrence O'Toole, a massively successful grade 1 pipe band from the Republic of Ireland, has a quote in A Piper's Tale where he said, talking about their tune selection, "We played what we liked to play ourselves, as opposed to what judges wanted to hear. We now have a better cross-section of music in the band in terms of what we play in competition, and it seems to be going down a lot better with judges." Now, that is certainly true because they won the World Pipe Band Championships in 2010. And since 1970, there has been an exponential increase in the number of competitors competing in piping competitions. Now, in pipe band contests, a lot of that is manifested in the actual size of bands increasing, but if you look back in the sort of 60s, the World Championships featured about 60 bands, and today they're featuring about 230, 240. Same in the solo competitions. The competitions that I've listed, the Argyllshire Gathering, the Northern Meeting, those have gone from having about 20 or 30 competitors to having 60 or 70. And there's actually requirements now to get into those competitions. So it is more competitive to get into these things. And you can argue that that's negative to music because you have competitors who are going to start making decisions based on how they can achieve this success not necessarily about, how can they produce the best music. I'm not saying the two things are mutually exclusive, but they do coexist. There are also some people who would argue that this is a positive, that it drives the standard of piping up. I would argue that the standard of piping today is probably the highest it's ever been. There's some arguments to be made about homogenous sort of styles, but the actual quality of people's instruments and the quality of performance is very, very high. And then playing into this sort of idea of competition performance paradigm and social standing and becoming successful, there is the idea of the practitioner-practice relationship and the social behavior and function of music in society. So this isn't unique to piping. In any musical genre, people will make decisions to be seen as being a part of a community. In piping, this manifests as some competitors or some bands might select unique tunes, unheard tunes, because they want to stand out. They want to have that individual identity. Whereas other people will select really well-known tunes because they want to be seen as a serious competitor. And that might be to the end of they want to be recognized as a member of that competitive piping elite. But all of this, as we'll kind of talk about in a bit, is situated within a context of tradition and tradition bearer. So, talking about the pipe band MSR, we've analyzed my own pipe band MSR experience. And here what I've done is I've put up all of the tunes that were played, well, the MSR tunes anyway, that were played in the World Pipe Band Championships between 1991 and 2015, at least those for which I could find repertoire data information. Now, we're talking about, what, a 20 odd year period here, 27 years, 26 years, math, not my strong suit. And in these 316 performances that we have data for, there are 38 marches. Going back to TPR, that's 12% of the total possible repertoire, meaning that 88% of submitted tunes during this time had already been submitted previous. To put into context the level of repetition in the repertoire here, the top two tunes, the Highland Wedding and the Clan McRae Society, make up almost a third of all the marches submitted during this time period. And the top 5 tunes featured in 54% of all of the submitted MSRs. We can do the same thing with the Strathspeys. Here's the list of Strathspeys played at the World Pipe Band Championships between 1991 and 2015. In this instance, there's 21 tunes. That gives us a total possible repertoire of 7%. And similarly to the March, 1/3 of MSRs contain Susan MacLeod or Athol Cummers and Bogenlachen, which are the same tune with different names. And the top 5 tunes make up 71% of the submitted repertoire. And then going into the reels, again, I found 316 examples of repertoire. There are 18 tunes in this list, which is 6% of the total possible repertoire. In other words, 94% of all performances during this time period had repeated repertoire. The top 2 tunes, John Morrison of Ascent House and Mrs. McPherson of Inveran, featured in 38% of all MSRs submitted during this time. And the top 5 tunes made up 73% of all the reels submitted during this time period. So I had a look at this, and it really confirmed in hard numbers what I think everybody in the pipe band world already knows about competitive piping. And it led me to wonder, why is this way? Why do bands do this? So I conducted a number of interviews and went out and looked for some references in old publications and whatnot. And as we go through these interviews, it's important to mention that I conducted all these interviews, I transcribed all the interviews, and then I coded them, and I looked for themes that came up in the coding. So I would assign sort of words to different ideas that these soloists and bands persons or adjudicators talked about. And then I collated those to kind of find what were the most common themes, what were the things that were the most important. So looking back to 1955 in the Piping Times, there's a great quote. We're talking about 70 years ago now. For the most part, bands are content to play away at the tried and trusty favorites. Occasionally a new one is introduced, and in some cases this is quite successful. Noteworthy in recent years was the introduction of Donald McLean's Farewell to Oban by the Newton Grange Pipe Band. Many innovations, of course, are much less successful, and occasionally at competitions we hear a band struggling through a tune which will never be played by anyone except themselves. And generally they only play it because their pipe major composed it. So there's three things that I pulled out of this quote. The first is that tried and trusty favorites. It, to me, implies that idea of risk aversion. We're going to play tunes that we know we can play them in competition, and they're not going to be risky. The second is occasionally new tunes are played. It indicates that even back in 1955, there weren't that many tunes being introduced to the pipe band MSR canon. And then lastly, and this is a talk for another evening, is the idea of band members composing the music that these bands are playing. Now that's something that still exists today, and really the 78th Phrasers launched that with the likes of, Michael Gray and Bruce Gandy and them composing music for that ensemble. And that idea of like a composer in residence composing music for your medley performance that gives your band that sort of musical identity. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into that tonight. But we can go ahead 50 years from this quote, still in the Piping Times. Isn't it time the RSPBA disallowed prize winners from playing their winning March Just Bay and reel pieces in subsequent years? Like me, I'm sure the crowd was sick to death of hearing the Highland Wedding, Lord Alexander Kennedy, McAllister's Dirk, and other pipe band staples. A simple rule change forcing the bands to learn new MSRs would entertain the crowd better and perhaps give lesser bands a chance of creating an upset. Like the previous quote, there's a couple of interesting things to tease out of this. The first is, this is written with a sense of frustration. Now, I am guilty of associating with that sense of frustration and that sense of playing sort of tried and trusty tunes over and over. But that manifests itself in the audience for pipe bands. If you watch the World Pipe Band Championships broadcast on the BBC, you'll notice that the audience for the MSR competition is noticeably smaller than the audience for the medley competition. And in terms of numbers, there's a YouTube channel called Drone Chorus that is sort of the premier YouTube channel for showing pipe band competitions. And they upload all the performances from all the major championships, MSR and medley. If you go on their website and you look at the most popular videos, the top 28 are all medleys. The 29th most popular video is the first MSR. So that does indicate that people aren't really listening to MSRs as much as they're listening to medleys. The statement of pipe band staples does indicate that there is a sort of canon of accepted tunes. And lastly, the idea of lesser bands creating an upset by using new music suggests the importance of repertoire selection in competitive success. So, like I said, I interviewed a number of grade 1 pipe majors. Pipe majors are like the conductors of pipe bands. They kind of call the shots. And adjudicators. And the grade 1 pipe majors I did interview were both current and retired. There were a number of interesting things that kind of came out of these interviews. And the first was the idea of risk and risk mitigation. So I had a private conversation with a grade 1 pipe major. Unfortunately, I can't tell you who he is because it is sort of off the record that way. But he described the desire to be musically creative and interesting as being a driving force of what he does. But he identified that he has about 40 men and women in his pipe band that are counting on him to produce a product that will win prizes. And as such, at times, he made musical sacrifices for the competitive good of the band. One of those being playing established prize-winning March Strathspey and reel sets. I spoke to Ken Eller, who is a former grade 1 pipe major and a current Royal Scottish Pipe Band Association adjudicator, who sort of hit on this topic. He said there's lots of tunes like that. He's talking about big tunes that are suitable for pipe band competition. There's only so many good competitive tunes, it seems, but I think the list is expanding now with the influence of good, strong musicians and solo pipers. I think at the end of the day, they're playing good tunes on the boards and the solos and can take that into the band. And this is the most important part. It takes a receptive pipe major to play it. So my experience, I think this quote speaks to the experience of a bands person versus the leadership, wherein my immediate thought is what I'm doing. I'm playing these tunes. And that can be frustrating. And so maybe you go to the pipe major and you say, here's this different tune we could play. Here's this piece of music that, maybe would be really good for the band. But that pipe major then has to take that and weigh it against what will happen in competition. And that relationship between pipe major and player is important. And that's something that I think a lot of us in the pipe band world lose sight of. And then just an example that came up in a conversation with another adjudicator was Inverarian District, who played David Ross. I can't remember the year it was, but David Ross is sort of an established solo tune, and they played it in the band, but they only played it for 1 year. And the adjudicator indicated to me that they pulled it because they were struggling to kind of get the music out of it, that maybe it wasn't suited to the pipe band idiom quite as much as they thought. And so for the sake of competitive success, they pulled it the next year. Which brings us to the topic of suitability for pipe band MSRs. What makes a tune suitable? Now, Dr. Simon McCarroll did an extensive amount of research into this in his 2005 PhD dissertation, and he came up with ideas like emphatic motifs, number of parts, anchor points, and arpeggiated motion in terms of what makes a good tune. Now, I conducted interviews and I asked pipe majors, what do you think makes a good pipe band MSR? And there were two ideas that really came to the fore, and that was the number of parts in a tune and drummer preference. So pipe majors indicated they preferred playing tunes with 6 or 8 parts rather than the requisite 4, because it allowed them to show off a little bit, right? My band can handle this 6-parted march and this 6-parted strathspey and this 8-parted reel. Interestingly, Ian McClellan, pipe major of the Strathclyde Police Pipe Band, indicated that when he first took the band, he selected 4-parted tunes. And then as the band got more and more talented and their technical ability grew, he was able then to start selecting 6 and 8-parted tunes to impress the judges. And the same thing with the with the drummer preference. The idea of playing a 6 or 8-parted tune, sort of the point was the drummers want that extra time to show off their virtuosity and impress the judges. But the key takeaway here is the conversation is revolving around impressing the judges. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the solo MSR. James, you might have to pull the plug on me hard here. Now, the solo MSR competition is a little bit different from the band MSR. There's a couple of key differences that we need to consider. The first is there's no group dynamic, right? If I'm playing in a solo competition, I don't have to worry about 39 other people. I don't have to worry about a drum corps. All I have to worry about is myself. If I choose to do something risky, then it's just on me. Another point is there's no drummers. So we don't need to consider, is this music going to be good for a drum corps? And lastly, and likely the most important, is the adjudicator filter. So in the pipe band MSR, we talked about, the fact that the people were choosing tunes based on the competition and wanting to impress judges. However, how it works is you submit your 2 MSRs on the day and one's drawn at random. It works a little bit differently in solo competition. In a solo contest, a piper might submit anywhere from 3 to 8 tunes, and then the judge will pick which tunes they want to hear. So there's this ultimate filter that all the music that gets performed in solo competition goes through, and that is a direct adjudicator filter. Now, I would love to walk you through all of the repertoire data for the solo MSR from 1947 to 2015, but unfortunately, we don't have time to do that. So what I've done here is I've basically shown the increase and decrease, or inverse of that, of how much repertoire was being played. So I split the period of 1947 to 2015 into 3 different time periods so that I could compare and contrast them. So the first period, 1947 to 1969, compared against the second time period, 1970 to 1990. If you look at sort of the right side of your screen here, we see a general increase in the amount of tunes being played, the total possible repertoire. However, from 1970 to 1990, moving into 1991 to 2015, we generally see a decrease and the size of the repertoire being submitted, which is interesting because there are actually more performances we're finding, or that I could find information on. So I went away and I said, right, there is a canon that's been established by Simon McCarroll, and then I expanded that in my own work. There's accepted and unaccepted tunes to play in competition. I started to wonder, why is it that we play what we play? Now, I use the term we loosely here because I don't play in the competitions that I'm discussing. And I found there were two broad factors, intrinsic and extrinsic. So there were factors that the artists considered that were very personal: musicality, technical difficulty, personal ability, and personal preference. What do they want to play? What do they like to play? And then there's the extrinsic factor, the factor of adjudicator preference. Is the tune of a standard for this competition? What are other competitors playing? So we can go through these. But before we do that, something interesting that happened in my interviews was that when I asked these competitors, why do you play what you play? All of them but one launched into talking about music, artistic vision, the competitive framework, but only one mentioned the importance of selecting music from the accepted canon of repertoire. Things like the Donald MacLeod collections or the Willie Ross books. Who are the composers that we're really able to use? I thought that was interesting because it creates this space of assumed cultural knowledge. These top competitors assumed that I would know that there are things you are able to play and things that you're not able to play, things that are accepted and things that aren't accepted. But let's talk a little bit about the intrinsic factors in solo competition. So the first is musicality and technical difficulty. Now, we'll talk about these sort of as individuals, but they do all kind of come together to form a system. So you would think that musicality would be first foremost in terms of what people would be thinking about when selecting repertoire, but it is influenced by these other things. So a couple of quotes here. Roddy McLeod, incredible player. So for me, it's liking the tune, finding it's melodic, feeling that I don't have any trouble spots within the tune, and therefore feeling that I'm very confident and comfortable with it. So what Roddy's really identifying here is that, there's this idea of, I want to like the tune, I want to think it's musical, and then maybe hitting on, there's nothing that's really going to throw me off, and I'm going to be confident in competition. Sort of against that, Ian McLeod talked about it and said, you have to select tunes that you can perfect for a start, not that you want to play, so that you're giving the adjudicators a more difficult time to knock you back. So his thing is technicality. Are you able to play these tunes to a technical level? And I know that gets into extrinsic, but it's that idea of musicality and technique coming together. Now, at the highest level of competition, good technique is expected. And so you would think that, or the sort of goal is for these competitions to shift onto a music competition, who plays the most musical performance. And to that end, personal ability and preference comes in, because pipers will have to choose tunes that they know they can play technically well, and that they will enjoy playing technically well. There's a phrase that comes up a lot: suits the hands. And it's like the piper equivalent of having good chops. So the idea that these pipers are looking for tunes that are musically and technically suited to their own style. For example, I love the tune Bonnie Ann, but I won't play it because it doesn't really suit the way that I play. Now, all of the soloists that I interviewed stated that there are tunes that they like, but they won't compete with because there's something in the tune that doesn't fit their style of play. So to that end, in the intrinsic sort of side of competition, competitors are thinking about, am I playing a tune that's musical? Do I enjoy playing this tune? Do I find it to be a challenge? Is it technically challenging to me? And am I really going to enjoy what I'm playing? Now, there are also some extrinsic factors to consider. And as with the previous example, these all form together into a system. And the first is one of the ones from the intrinsic factors, that's technical ability. But here we're really talking about technical difficulty in terms of, is the tune impressive? Does it merit entrance into these high level competitions? competitors have cited the importance of impressing judges and standing out from the crowd with their technical prowess. To that end, melodic but simple tunes are avoided in competition but played in recitals. A good example is Donald McLean's Farewell to Oban. It was once very common in the top level of solo competition, and now it's relegated to the lower levels of solo competition and sort of ceilidh bands. Another point here is that technical faults were listed by adjudicators as a common reason for putting players out of the prize list. Now, the influence of other competitors is the idea that tunes need to be of a similar or higher standard than that of their contemporaries. So these competitors were saying, if somebody's playing a really difficult tune, I better be playing something that is similarly difficult in order to be able to compete with that. On the flip side of that, there is the avoidance of popular tunes, because this becomes a direct comparison for the judge. If you have somebody going out who, say, plays Lord Alexander Kennedy very, very well, and you decide to go out and play Lord Alexander Kennedy, then you have to play it as well or better than this other competitor. So a lot of competitors said that they'll go out and try to find tunes that maybe aren't so popular at the moment to put them in. And then there's the idea of selecting sort of fresh tunes that the judges know but maybe haven't heard in a while as being a way to get a step up. Now, with precedence, we go back to the idea of the canon, and competitors tended to say that they avoided selecting tunes that were outside of the recognized canon of solo MSR tunes. They really wanted to pick tunes that adjudicators knew and were familiar with. Donald McPhee said to me, "I don't go into competition to experiment." And I was given the piece of advice personally by another top player and judge: your job isn't to educate the judges. And here it's a risk mitigation factor. If you have a judge listening to a tune they don't know, they don't only have to adjudicate the way you're playing it. Ultimately, they have to adjudicate whether or not they like the tune. You're increasing the number of factors that go into whether or not you're successful. And the theme here that I heard was, don't make your life harder than it has to be. And the last thing here is adjudicator preference. And that really came down to two things: familiarity, which goes back to sort of precedence, and performer's ability. So with familiarity, if you play a tune that a judge doesn't know, one of the things that came up was if you make a mistake, the judge doesn't know if you've made a mistake. You could play it very musically, but if the judge doesn't know, then they're not really being fair to the competitors who are playing tunes that they know. If they make a mistake, they recognize it, that player will go down on the list. This is contrary to what pipers think, currently competing pipers, who think that playing new music is inherently disadvantageous. Also, some judges do like to hear new music. The freshness can give the competitor an advantage. I spoke to a few judges who said if somebody comes out and puts in a new tune, then I might pick it because maybe I'll like it. And another thing with the familiarity that pipers consider is the judges know the tunes inside and out. They know what to listen for. So in a tune like Susan McLeod, if I'm judging a junior contest, I know to listen for that third part. Are they going to get those bubbly notes? And there's an expectation for that. And if that expectation is not met, then it can hurt your chances. And then the last sort of thing with familiarity is that well-known difficult tunes might receive more accolade for technique than lesser known difficult tunes. So if there's two tunes of a similar technical ability, and one person comes out and plays Pretty Marion, okay, very difficult reel. Another person comes out and plays a lesser known tune that's just as hard. The judge might not recognize that. They might not recognize that tune as being as hard as Pretty Marion, but they hear Pretty Marion, which they know is a difficult tune, and they give accolade for that. And then the last sort of thing in the extrinsic factors here is the performer's ability. And all the judges I spoke to, they said that they like to pick tunes that they know the competitor can play well because they want to hear good music. Ultimately, that's what we all want. We all want to hear good music. However, sometimes the competitors get these tunes over-selected and they get a little bit bored and they stop wanting to play these tunes. They might take them out of their list. So there's all this talk about sort of that mix of, well, I want to do things that I think are musically valid, but I also want to impress the judges. And so I asked all of the competitors that I spoke to, would they ever change their musical style to suit an adjudicator's preference? And the answer was overwhelmingly no. There were references to sort of your own personal musical identity and the respect for that, and also the respect for your teachers. My teacher taught me to play in such a way. I need to respect that and go out and play the way I play. Now, this does go against the willingness to sort of change the repertoire. And I spoke to at least one competitor who said that he would change the tunes he was putting in depending on who the judge was. So if he knew a judge didn't like a particular tune, he would pull it and put a new tune in, but he wouldn't change the way that he played. Now, I kind of pressed Finley Johnston on this. He had said, in his interview that everybody who competes plays to win. And I questioned him on that. I said, well, if you're playing to win, why won't you change your musical style? And he fired right back. He said, remember that I said there was a precursor before that. I said that music is the most important part of the whole thing. So I asked him, why would you change your repertoire to suit the competition, but not your style? And this was his very eloquent response. I think that's the thing. I say that I want to win, like everybody wants to win, but deep down, I want to play really well. That's the main thing. Winning, you're not in control of that. All you're in control of is what you're doing. I think that's a really nice sentiment about competition and music. He talked a lot about the strategic things that he does in terms of selecting music, but ultimately it comes back to the music. Now, I also have to say, we are coming to the end here, that just about every competitor and adjudicator that I spoke to said that they don't really want the MSR competition to change. Some reasons for that were that it's an achievable and consistent goal for young players. So, even somebody like myself who's coming up to the ranks, there are goalposts there that I can aim for. And if we change a competition, it moves those goalposts. And so there's an idea of consistency for the upcoming sort of generation of players. And then a lot of them cited the idea of the protection of tradition. This has been done this way for a long time. We're now doing it, and soon it'll be the next generation's turn to go on doing this style of competition. And when asked about any sort of change, they all indicated that it would need to come from the judges, because ultimately, judges are in control of what's being played. It is a key factor in everything they're considering. Last point is sort of an aside, and that's the idea of tradition, right? So I was talking about tradition and, we play these tunes because they've been played for so long and there's a tradition surrounding this. But it factors differently into different decisions. So one of the things that I asked was, how have you seen the art form change? And a really frequent answer was the actual instrument. We're not playing, not everybody plays sheepskin pipe bags and cane drone reeds. Lots of people play synthetic bags. They play synthetic reeds. We use tuners. There's lots of things that we're doing now that are modern ideas. And it kind of put it to me that we're not willing to change what we play in terms of the music, but we are willing to change what we play in terms of the instrument. And so that idea of, what traditions are able to be changed and developed and what traditions are sort of sacrosanct is an interesting point. But in conclusion, in MSR competitions, there's definitely a limited repertoire that we use. And there are attached notions of repertoire inclusivity and exclusivity. There are yeses and nos in competition. And the reality is that the factors in choosing this repertoire are an intricate mix of musical identity, desire for competitive success, and notions of tradition. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was a fascinating talk, as we knew it would be. We now have 7 minutes for questions, which, as people have been flooding the Q&A box, means about a minute a question. So brevity will be appreciated in your answers. However, if somebody does have anything that they want to add, please do add it into the Q&A box. I'd like to pick up on something that Susan asked at the very beginning of your talk. She says, what are you doing? What are you going to do about your findings to change things for the better? And I'd like to add a sort of other caveat into that, in terms of decolonizing music and in terms of underrepresented groups in composing and in making sure that there is a representation in the music that we play and program. Could your research help facilitate that in some way? And how do you think that you could go about it in that manner?
Yeah. So to answer Susan's question, that's a good question. There has been some talk in the piping world about changing up the pipe band scene. I'm not entirely. I have some plans for the solo scene. I have a couple ideas about some possible competitions at the National Piping Center that I'd like to run, that would feature new music. But that's a project for the next year or two. In terms of the pipe band scene, I think it's ready for a shake-up. The medley was introduced in 1970 as a reaction to the idea of stagnation in the MSR. And there's been more and more chatter in the pipe band community about the stagnation of the MSR and the fact that it hasn't really changed. So I have a couple ideas. I'm considering putting together a proposal to the RSPBA, but it would take pipe majors like Doug McRae there getting on board with it. And, the community has to want it. My research, while there's lots of people in my research saying that they want things to change, there are lots of people who like things the way they are. And so that needs to be considered. In terms of your question, James, about underrepresentation, it's a big issue to begin with in piping, right? It's largely white men who do it. Now, there has been an increase in the female piping community. That's one of the research topics I'm interested in tackling in the coming year or two, is sort of gender in piping and in pipe bands. It's been talked about a little bit, but I need to find somebody who's a specialist in gender roles and gender studies to take that on with me. I think that's the first thing to tackle is gender representation, and then from there, we can look at sort of a minority representation.
Thank you. Joe Moore and 3 people have upvoted this, so it's a popular question. Says that they went to a Q&A at Piping Live with Rob Matheson and Gary West, and they suggested that bands could be judged and rewarded for innovation, but also, and I think that this is the important part, that street marching should be judged as that's what most bands are used to doing and how audiences see them. Facing into each other in a circle is not playing to the audience. I think that means while you're thinking about the judge and that, there is a huge audience for pipe bands. To what extent does pleasing your audience make a difference in your repertoire choice?
Yeah, so for me personally, that's a huge part of it, right? Like when I give a performance and I hear the roar of the crowd, that's very rewarding for me. And we are probably the only art form where we play with our backs to the audience. There's been some experimentation with the idea of playing in a semicircle. There's some problems there in terms of tone and tuning, and you can get away with things if you're playing in a circle. So this is where competitors aren't always willing to maybe go to that new semicircle formation, because it opens up to hearing some things you might not otherwise hear in terms of mistakes or bad blowing or things like that. As far as being adjudicated on marching, I think that there's a place for that. I don't think it's the World Pipe Band Championships. I think that the World Pipe Band Championships focus should be on music. The phrase that I use, maybe I might get in trouble for this, is, but you go to the Edinburgh Tattoo to see good piping, and you go to the World Pipe Band Championships to hear good piping. I'm not saying that the playing at the Edinburgh Tattoo isn't good, but you can't argue with the quality in the Grade 1 arena at the World's Championship. I think that maybe answers the question.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it gives you they are very different competitions and have different points. Like the purpose of it is different, which leads us on to a slight other question. So Lucy has said, do competitive bands have other creative outlets? I'm thinking of in comparison to the brass band world, which this question comes back to something I asked you in the first time I ever heard you speak, which is highly competitive, but bands also spend time giving concerts and making recordings. Is the tattoo versus the World Pipe Band Championships the sort of equivalency, do you think?
Yeah, well, in the band, in even in the medley, we're working within constraints, right? Like the idea of the medley is you're meant to have 5 to 7 minutes to do whatever you want. However, that's not really the case anymore. All you have to do is look at what Toronto Police did in 2008 to know that there's a reaction to it, which means that there must be a conventional tradition to how we have to play medleys. Incidentally, I saw Michael Gray's in the audience. I am a fan of that medley. Uh, there are other places for us to try things risk free, and those are our. However, concerts are the exception, not the norm. I've played two of them since I moved to Scotland. I think on the whole, I've maybe played in a dozen. They're not all that common. But if you're playing a concert, it is an opportunity to try new things, try out a suite, try out, a quartet that then features the band. And, all you have to do is go online and look up the pre-Worlds concert to see some of that. But unfortunately, the sort of guidelines that we're shoved into in competition at the moment are quite strict. So those other places, they do exist, but they're not common.
Fair enough. We are dead on 7 o'clock. Yvonne, do you need to leave now? Because I know that you have another. You do. So I'm afraid that we are going to have to put all of these questions, all of which are truly relevant and would have been lovely to hear you talk about, on hold. I'm sure that you wouldn't mind people getting in touch with you to discuss these things.
Not at all. If you want to reach me with a question, please just email me. My email's abova@rcs.ac.uk. Happy to have conversations. If you have me on Facebook, reach out on Facebook. If you have me on Twitter, reach out on Facebook. I don't really use Twitter. But yeah, feel free to get in touch. Always happy to chat about it.
There's been some absolutely lovely comments in the chat, and I would just like to echo them all and say thank you for fascinating, well presented and articulate talk. Thank you to Yvonne for signing for us. And thank you to you for coming and listening to this knowledge exchange talk. If this has whet your whistle for all things piping and drumming, next week we're going to move slightly further away from the Scottish pipe band scene and look at gamelan drumming with Dr. Simon van der Walt. So do please get your ticket for that. And all that's left to say is thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everybody, for attending. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, James.